them into different styles, but the truth is that they are all related to this part of our brain that is helping us either try to find a solution or we just freeze. And then there's some other components as well, and it has so much to do with our biology. It's very, very interesting, that can take us back to certain situations that we experienced as children, and we feel like it's the same situation and we forget that we have control and we have choice. So we go right back there and we can stay there until finally someone or ourselves will knock ourselves out of that place and come back to present and find some solutions. So yeah, to answer your question, I think the contexts obviously are different, but there are some similar reactions between each of those types of people.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it is. I think particularly in the online world, we actually see quite a lot of the internal conflict, almost, that I would say, between people who are putting themselves out there as business owners, but tend to shy away from the money side of it. And yet there is this underlying commercial reality that the money becomes a byproduct of whatever it is they're hoping to do. And to do more of that thing and to make the impact, we need to be keeping a different kind of spiral going in terms of the generation of that to keep momentum moving. But as you say, how we then adapt to a launch that doesn't go as well as we hoped, or losing a client, or suddenly finding 5 clients, and what that does at the other end of the scale in terms of a sudden injection of money, and we can feel paralyzed about that as well. So I'm interested now to delve a little bit deeper into this relationship between the employer and the employee, or in the online world, of course, it's very typical for us to have a model where there is a principal business person, but they tend to subcontract some very specific things,
right?
VAs, Facebook, copywriting, all these sorts of things. We call on a number of people and we call them our team. And we have this sort of daily or monthly relationship with people to provide for our businesses. So I'm guessing that I'm really treating the two things as being a very parallel scenario, to be fair.
Yes.
So how does it really work? How does it manifest itself then? What happens when we find employees who are in this money stress? How would an employer even recognize that was going on in that employee's life?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because often it depends on the employer themselves. I think sometimes employers can, their gut tells them that their employees or their subcontractors are in financial trouble and they don't want to address it themselves because it might be triggering or they're going through the same thing. And I'm moving forward into another topic that we'll probably chat about in a little bit. But just, it's good to be aware of things like behavior shifting. So someone who is, this is rather obvious, but it's good to watch for if someone has a prolonged shift in their behavior where they might seem a bit more depressed, or they're more animated, maybe they're talking about money a lot more all of a sudden. It doesn't have to be bad, but maybe they seem to be a bit more even obsessive about it. Maybe they're more tired. And that could be because they are up at night worrying about money. Literally, their quality of work is a lower standard. That's, I think, and we're going to talk about that, I know, in a little bit too. Yeah. That's very key. Why is their quality of work suddenly lower? There are all of these little tips, and it might not have anything to do with money, but I think as an employer, especially as an employer, it's really good to watch for those red flags, because it might not be money. It might be something else as well. And there are ways to help people through all of that. But money, we don't know how pervasive money problems really are and what they bring to the bottom line, what they bring to your team. And so just watching for those little signs and watching for the opportunities to have some chats to dig in a little bit more without being nosy or intrusive.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things, isn't it? As you say, the change in behaviour, and change in behaviour is one of the things that people talk about a lot with addictions of all sorts of varieties, and particularly the changes in patterns of behaviour as well. One of the other things that you mentioned there, of course, is a dropping off in work performance.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where I think it really manifests itself from a profit perspective, of course, because we're as business owners, we employ these people, we're tasking these people to do whatever it is they're supposed to be doing for us, and all of a sudden, if part of that puzzle is missing, it can often take a while before we realize it in terms of the financials, let's say, or the numbers that actually get reported back, that these things can actually go undetected for quite a while, and there is this sort of gradual erosion going on, and we can't quite put our fingers on it. What are some of the things that we would be looking out for as an employer, beyond the sort of things that you said? I mean, is for example, would absenteeism be a possible change in behaviour? And of course, people not being at work is a problem for us because we're expecting people to perform a function. We can plan for holidays, and yes, of course, people get sick from time to time. But if we suddenly pick up on a different piece of behaviour, is that a common thing that tends to happen?
Yeah, for sure. There is this great term that I love, and it's presenteeism. So people are at work. That's great. I mean, we've all been at work and not been at work. Let's face it, right?
Yeah.
And presenteeism is a great term to use for when we go to work and we're sick. You know, we're not performing at all. That's a great example. It's a real life example. We've been there. It's like, I'm just going to show up. I don't want to call in sick. I don't want to get razzed by the boss, or I have a project I have to finish, right? But presenteeism can be very pervasive because someone's sitting at their desk looking like they're working, but what they're really doing is either running numbers through their head or trying to figure out how they're going to solve the current financial problem, or the distraction of their money stress is just leading them to create these bigger imagined problems. They just get bigger, and before they know it, there's like 45 minutes or an hour, or maybe they've decided that they need to talk to a coworker about it, or they're on the phone dealing with creditors, with their spouse, whatever it is. So sure, they're at work, but these money problems can actually, the statistics are telling us, they can actually suck up about 2 weeks worth of productivity a year. 2 weeks worth. That's many hours of spending time on money. And in worst case scenarios, it's way more than that. So it's that's a hard one to watch for, Jason, until, like you said, sometimes you get the numbers. But then again, there are many roles where we have to produce things, like a virtual assistant has to produce something, or in a corporate setting. I used to work in payroll. A good example around that would be if I was just screaming in at the last minute with payroll, getting it ready.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things are good examples that something has gone awry, especially if it isn't normal. If this has been happening since the beginning, well, hopefully you've caught on to that since the beginning. This isn't the kind of performance we want. But if there's been, again, that shift, we've got to watch for that and just ask the right questions.
What about, I'll say, some of the more potentially obvious things? Theft, as an example. People being short of money. You know, you often hear about concepts of embezzlement and these sorts of things going on. How people choose to do things. There was the very first job I ever had was working for builders merchants. And part of what happened when you started was you went off to go and do this 2-day induction course and covered all sorts of things about the company. But one of the things that we were told, and it was sort of a graduate training program, so there was this expectation you would end up in a management role of some description. So builders merchanting, building generally not very well paid. So there is the potential for an obvious trail of examination here in terms of people not being paid much anyway, trying to make up money from somewhere somehow. Mm-hmm. And we were all asked this question about, if you were going to remove things from your branch, how would you do it? And apparently they'd found out that one of the most common ways that people actually stole product out of a branch was to put it in a skip. And it was because it was believed to be the one place that nobody would ever think of looking. and then they just come back and collect it later.
Mm-hmm.
So these sorts of things, that's a very obvious example, as it were, in terms of where money is actively involved, perhaps, but there's clearly erosion of profit going on as product gets removed from the branch, wastage, those sorts of things typically. But I'm also thinking about the change in behaviour. How bad could the change in behaviour get in terms of how it affects other employees within the workplace? What other sort of risks could an employer be opening themselves up for, perhaps?
Yeah, well, there's this has nothing to do with theft, but I'm thinking about when I was going through my money crisis, how much time I spent visiting other people's desks, in particular one other woman, talking about it. So, I mean, there's a loss of productivity and time there, because I actually said to her, Jason, leaning over her desk, and I said to her, I'll never forget it, I hate money. And then something went ding, 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 something's not quite right here. I don't think I should have said that. So there's simple things like that. But I love that you were talking about theft, because people don't like to think that their coworkers would do that. Having worked in a bank, I know that these things happen regularly, and you catch on to them fairly quickly for the most part, because there's always the checks and balances, right?
Yeah.
But I have heard, I heard a story years and years ago, like you said, 2.5 decades in the industry. Oh my gosh. So when the tellers used to have their cash drawer, one of the women used to put a bundle of $20 bills, so $2,000, into a garbage can when she would start her shift. So if she was ever robbed, she could say, oh, they got all of this. And then at the end of the shift, she put the $2,000 in or back in. So she was waiting for that awful instance of being robbed, which is no fun. And finally, what happened was they had to go through all the recycling to find something, and someone found the money in there. So that must have been a very uncomfortable situation, and she was fired. Yeah. But that's a tough one, because we don't like to think that people are going to do it. But just being proactive and putting in those checks balances are really important, whether it's with product, whether it's with cash. You got to do it. We're not going to prevent it completely. People are always going to find ways, like the one you described, right? But just have the attitude that it might happen. Pay attention to the stories that other people in the industry are telling you, and just put it in, because it keeps everybody safe. Everybody.
Yeah, I think I think it is definitely one of those things that, working in that sort of office environment, there is this sort of co-worker responsibility, and I don't know whether or not it's something that I think has maybe come out more over the course of the last 10 years, post 2008. More and more people inevitably know people who have now been made redundant. That concept of protecting a bigger thing, I think, is out there as a much more conscious thing now than perhaps it used to be, to that end, because jobs are that much harder to come by and large, in corporate world to that extent. So protecting the bigger thing and not putting a whole business at risk, I think there is a general underlying context now that people do tend to try and keep a keener eye, and relationships are more deeply forged perhaps with people that they work with now. So how does an employer start to address this? Because I'm also thinking here that some employers may also be or periodically, and certainly from an entrepreneurial perspective, it's very easy to find yourself in what you would consider to be at least a mini money crisis, even if it's only a short-term thing and you recognize it as so, having been through a cycle or whatever it might be previously. But I'm guessing that a lot of employers and again, entrepreneurs employing team members would find it a difficult discussion to have in terms of approaching it, or asking the question, or broaching the question in the first place. How do people get comfortable with that? Is there a series of techniques, or is there an easy way to start that conversation typically?
Yeah, well, first let's address the corporate side of that. If the company is a larger company, they will typically have an HR department, and hopefully within that HR department have people who are skilled at asking the right questions, at addressing issues. These days, so many HR representatives, directors, managers are also skilled coaches. They've gone through that kind of training, so they know how to ask. However, not every, and they actually, I should go back. Those larger companies also have programs that they can refer their employees to as well. They have help. So they would ask questions, and these are great questions for people of smaller companies to know. They would ask questions